The other day I was pretty surprised to see Chinese-style pork ribs at my local butcher. So I assembled everything I needed to make some Cantonese-style steam ribs. Steamed ribs are not an uncommon thing to find at a lot of dim sum restaurants. Even if you're not used to steaming as a form of meat preparation, it's a really tasty and flavorful enough dish that it's a good introduction to this way of cooking. You might be put off by the fact that meat cooked this way comes out a little gray, because we don't sear the meat before cooking it in the steamer, although that might be an interesting thing to try one day. The process itself is pretty easy. First, cut up your ribs and then give them a good dredge in cornstarch before rinsing that all off with water. After that, marinate your ribs, preferably overnight. Drop in some dried chilies and some washed black beans, and then give it a good steam for 15 to 20 minutes. Dredging the meat through the cornstarch helps get the myoglobin out of the proteins. And as you know, what keeps the meat red is actually the myoglobin, and it is not at all blood. The cornstarch extracts that myoglobin from the meat to ensure something that is a little less pink when you cook it. I never used to do this for myself, but then I saw Randy's dad do it on his channel Made with Lao, who shows you a more traditional method of making steamed ribs with black beans. I highly recommend you check it out. His page is beautiful. Now, the main two deviations from a traditional recipe here are two things. Because I like to cut out as much sugar as I can from any recipe, I replace the sugar with erythritol, which, as I said before, in regards to savory applications, does a really good job in balancing out savory and salty foods with sweetness. It doesn't taste as good as sugar does on its own, but when it comes to balancing out a savory dish in the same way that sugar would, it does as good of a job as sugar does without the detriments of adding sugar. This is useful information if you're watching your weight or if you're diabetic, but if you really don't care either way, go ahead and just use sugar. Don't spend your money on just another thing. The second thing I added to the marinade was pickle juice. My friend had gifted me with some pickles that she had made, and I had wondered if using the brine from it to add to the marinade would add any kind of depth of flavor, which I would later find out, yes, it does. Returning now to our side quest. If you were with us in the last video, you would remember that I had a lot of extra pork belly left over, which I would then marinate and brine in a whole bunch of duojiao. Duojiao, as we know, is a popular Szechuan and Hunanese condiment made of chopped chilies and preserved almost exactly in the same way that kimchi is preserved. It's normally sold in little jars, but because I made a whole bunch of it using last of the season cayenne peppers, I found myself with nearly 4 gallons of the stuff in my fridge. Taking the pork belly out, it smelled sweet and salty and really peppery, a little bit funky from the fermentation of the chilies. I figured the best way to cook it now would be in a nice braise, so I'd prepared it as a roll like you would for Japanese chasu, and put it in a mixture of soy sauce, erythritol, star anise, cloves, bay leaf, black pepper, and cumin, which I would later then mix, vacuum seal, and then cook for 10 hours at 165 degrees in my sous vide circulator. Using a chamber vacuum sealer is pretty effective, although not widely available. It is available to me because before the pandemic, I used to run a secret restaurant out of my house, and that restaurant was actually pretty successful. We will find out how this tastes in the next video, but now we go back to the steam ribs, which at this point have been marinating for about 8 hours. Not quite overnight, but good enough. Take your salted black beans and wash them really well. They're covered in salt and you don't want them to be overly salty, so basically a couple of good rinses will do. Steaming times are going to vary depending on the size and shape of your steamer. Using this giant steaming tower as well as way too many ribs because I bought more than I thought I needed, it took between 15 and 20 minutes for all the ribs to cook all the way through and to get tender. You might find with a smaller setup that 10 minutes is enough. I very lazily crumbled some dried chilies on top of the pork to give it some spice, and then sprinkled some of the black beans on it as well. The black beans add an amazing little hit of umami saltiness to the already tender and tasty ribs. The pickle brine provided quite a nice hit of herbaceous sourness to the ribs that doesn't normally come with traditional Cantonese steam ribs. I think I'm going to do it with more pickle brine next time to see how far I can take that. Maybe even do a little sear at the beginning as well.